The year 2020, when a certain virus ripped its way across the planet, marked a huge shift in the way our world is organized. Among other things, the pandemic was the midwife to the birth of a digital-first world. This new order empowered tech companies, particularly those who control the cloud platforms on which business is done now, and led to an enormous transfer of wealth into the hands of the billionaire class. Welcome to the digital Gilded Age. So it's hardly news to describe 2020 and what happened that year as being of world historic importance. And it took a lot of people by surprise, but not astrologers. What's more, some powerful transnational entities had been planning for just such an event for quite some time and were clearly ready to take advantage of the opportunity it presented. Within months of the outbreak, World Economic Forum head Klaus Schwab announced what he called the Great Reset, a plan to completely remodel the global economy in a more, quote, sustainable way that would also empower the very transnational corporate, financial and bureaucratic interests that the WEF represents. Funny how that works. But there are, of course, striking astrological signatures for events of world historic importance. And my special guest in this episode, a legendary astrologer who's been practicing the art for a good half-century, has identified them. His name is Bill Meridian, and he's a financial and mundane astrologer, fund manager, and psychotherapist, all rolled into one. And he wrote the famous astrology magazine, Dell Horoscope's mundane astrology column, for more than 30 years. If you want to get a better understanding of how to do effective mundane or financial astrology, my advice is listen to Bill. And in this video, Bill and I are going to examine some of the astrology that marked this extraordinary episode in the history of the world. And in particular, we're going to look at two astrological charts that Bill believes are the horoscopes of the Great Reset itself. We're going to see how both of these charts feature certain astrological signatures that mark them as being of world historic importance. And we're also going to see how in less than 2 years, those signatures are going to be triggered again by some powerful astrology. So welcome to World Astrology Report with me, your host, Dan Waits, and get ready for another journey into the past to understand the present and the future. If you're enjoying this video, then please do me a favor and let YouTube know that and click that little like button. And remember to hit subscribe and even enable notifications if you really don't want to miss future episodes of World Astrology Report. I'd also like to remind you that I recently launched a paid membership service for this channel at worldastrologyreport.com. So firstly, I want to give a big shout out to all of you who have already joined. I really appreciate you and your support, and I'm loving the community of truly interesting and intelligent people that you're helping to create on the site. If you're not part of this already, then know this. Signing up will give you access to all sorts of exclusive benefits, most notably exclusive content, because members get access to special extended versions of new videos on this channel. For example, in the extended version of this video, available right now, we get Bill's takes on some of the biggest astrological configurations coming later this decade. And members have had access to this video for several days already. We also just held the first of many exclusive live streams and Ask Me Anything style Q&A, and there'll be many more of those to come. And signing up will give you access to the World Astrology Report forum, where you can talk astrology and geopolitics and weird occult stuff and all the rest of the things we get into on this channel with a community of like-minded people. So please do head over to worldastrologyreport.com and sign yourself up right now if that sounds good to you. Thanks for listening, and let's get back to the video. Before we get into the astrology, which I'm mostly going to leave to Bill, I think it's important that we have a picture of what the Great Reset really means. There are all sorts of, quote, conspiracy theories around the Great Reset, and there's still a lot of unknowns around what really happened in 2020, in my opinion, at least. But things are coming out, and there are some things we know for sure about the Great Reset. Because in mid-2020, as most of us were stuck in lockdowns, watching Ghanaian pallbearer memes, some people were dreaming of a better world. And one of them was that lovable old dreamer, Klaus Schwab, who, it must be said, is somehow becoming a friend of the show. In June 2020, Mr. Schwab released a manifesto of sorts in the form of a book describing how he thought the world should change in light of the opportunity offered by the pandemic. And it was called The Great Reset. This can be taken as Schwab's vision of the future, and by extension, that of the people we can call, for convenience, the Davos set. But rather than try to explain the Great Reset myself, I'm going to borrow the words of a writer much finer than myself, Paul Kingsnorth. His series of articles on what he calls the machine are, in my opinion, the best writing out there on the pandemic and the kind of world that Schwab and people like him want to build. In one of the many articles he wrote during the pandemic period, he directly tackled the theme of the Great Reset, and I've linked this article below. For his sins, Kingsnorth read Schwab's book, finding it simultaneously incredibly dull and subtly sinister. One of Schwab's major claims in the book was that many of the behaviors we had adopted during the pandemic were here to stay. And this wasn't, in Schwab's view, a bad thing. To get a flavor of Schwab's vision for where things should go, I offer you this, again, via Kingsnorth. Why, asks Schwab, would we endure driving to a distant family gathering for the weekend when the WhatsApp family group, though admittedly not as fun, is nevertheless safer, cheaper, and greener? Why indeed? And Schwab is pretty clear that COVID represents the opportunity for a power grab. From Kingsnorth, the COVID event, explains Schwab, has shown that we live in a world in which no one is really in charge. For plenty of us, this might sound like a good thing, but for globalist thinkers like Schwab, it is a problem to be solved. There cannot be a lasting recovery without a global strategic framework of governance. Some, including Bill, interpret Schwab's words in somewhat clearer language.
Well, the Great Reset was announced in June of 2020 by Klaus Schwab at the World Economic Forum. I bought the book and read it. It's very vague as to what it is, but it is undoubtedly, well, it depends on your view of history. There's been an attempt to create a one world government, I think going back to biblical times. So I knew exactly what he meant. I started reading about this a long, long time ago, 1966 when I was 17. And I've slowly tracked the progress of trying to melt all the world's governments into one. And so when he said it, I knew what he was referring to.
From my perspective, in terms of what I think Schwab is aiming for, I like this knockout paragraph from Kingsnorth. This is the essence of the Great Reset, the construction of a future which is at once controlled and catatonic, dystopian and dull, monitored and monotonous beyond bearing. A future in which global corporations are free to build the world they have long desired. A borderless, interconnected market technocracy in which each human individual is a tracked, traced, and monitored production and consumption machine, all in the name of public health and safety. So that's the Great Reset in a nutshell. In this episode, we're going to be examining two extremely important horoscopes that speak to the Great Reset, or to put it another way, to the world that is under construction. But before we do that, there are some things I'll need to explain because Bill uses some astrological techniques that I don't generally employ on this channel, but you'll need to have some understanding of them if you want to follow Bill's arguments. Uranian Astrology, or the Hamburg School of Astrology as it's also known, was developed by the German astrologer Alfred Vita in the 1920s. And it works very differently to the kind of astrology I use on this show. We won't have time for a full explanation of how it works here, but there are some major features of Uranian that Bill will refer to in this episode that you need to understand before we get going. Firstly, there's the use of what are called the trans-Neptunian planets. These are hypothetical planets. Yes, you heard that right. There are 8 of these hypothetical bodies: Cupido, Hades, Zeus, Kronos, Apollon, Admetus, Vulcanus, and Poseidon. They don't actually exist, at least as far as we're currently aware, but Uranian astrologers nevertheless treat them as if they're real, and many of them, including Bill, swear by them. They were identified by Vita and his collaborators before Pluto was discovered in 1930, hence them being labelled the trans-Neptunians. Vita and co. noticed that there seemed to be hidden bodies that were causing astrological effects when the visible planets reach certain areas of the zodiac. And they have very long cycles, lasting from 262.5 years in the case of Cupido, all the way up to 740 years in the case of Poseidon. So they are particularly suited to speaking to the kind of long-term shifts that we're interested in when we're doing mundane astrology.
I got into astrology in October of 72, and in 74, I started taking classes in New York, and I noticed people had all these planets in their charts that I didn't have. And so that's how I got introduced to it. To me, if you do mundane astrology and you're not using the mundane planets, to me, you're eating soup with a fork. They're very slow moving. I know they're hypothetical, but in 1974 or 5, a young black man named Michael Dubois blew us all away at a lecture in New York City. And I said, I have to study this.
Another feature of Uranian astrology that Bill makes regular use of is midpoints. The point halfway between any two astrological points is said to be those points' midpoint, and it's said to hold meanings derived from those of the two bodies concerned. The character of these points is described in Uranian textbooks, such as Alfred Vieta's Rules for Planetary Pictures and Reinhold Ebertin's The Combination of Stellar Influences. For example, when Uranus is at the midpoint of the Sun and Moon, which is expressed as Sun/Moon equals Uranus, Vieta's Rules for Planetary Pictures gives this meaning: exciting and trying days, daily tension in partnership and marriage, sudden events in a partnership, a clash with a friend or mate, sudden hostility, or separation. If you're interested in learning more about Uranian astrology and have basic astrological training, then I can wholeheartedly recommend this workshop by the excellent Michael Bryan, who I've linked in the description. And finally, there's one other feature that Bill brings to his astrology that we need to know about now, and that's the use of dwarf planets, or minor bodies. There are a lot of these bodies, which are smaller than planets, but much bigger than asteroids. Most have been discovered in recent years, in the 2000s in fact, and they're orbiting further out from the Sun than Neptune. Unlike the Uranian trans-Neptunians, these bodies are very real. They include the likes of Eris, who I talked about in this episode, Haumea, Makemake, Sedna, and Ixion, which we will meet in this very episode. Now, in this video, we're going to be looking at events of world historic importance, and there are particular astrological signatures that give away events of this kind, and among them are what is known as the world points.
In the Hamburg School of Astrology, 0 of the cardinal points, which would be 0 Aries, 0 Cancer, 0 Libra, 0 Capricorn, are the world points. And anything that occurs at those degrees comes directly out into the world. So if you're a writer, it's ideal to have your Mercury there. That means your writing is very easily accepted. When you speak, people want to hear what you have to say. If it's Venus and you're in the clothing business or in entertainment, then what you present is much more readily noticeable and acceptable than it will be for people who do not have that placement.
The Sun is found at these points on the 4 most symbolically potent moments of the year: the spring equinox, the summer solstice, the autumn equinox, and the winter solstice. Something else you should know is that in Uranian astrology, points that are square to each other are seen as connected. And the same applies to points that are semi-square, which is the 45-degree aspect. This means that points at 15 degrees of the fixed signs also carry some of the potency of the world points.
If I said William Shatner, everyone knows Captain Kirk. He's born with the Sun at 0 Aries. If I say Hillary, you don't even need to say the second name, Clinton. Her moon is very close, just short of 0 Aries. And Mars conjunct Pluto at 15 fixed. And if you're opening up a store, I mean, it's easy to put the moon at 0 degrees cardinal. And I actually, when I lived in the Middle East, I had clients who didn't want anyone to know where they were. So in that case, you take your electional charts and you don't want any planets near 0 cardinal or 15 fixed. So when you have an eclipse at that degree, it means the effect of the eclipse affects the entire world. The last one we had was just before 9/11. It was at 0 Cancer. When Mars activated that eclipse point, we had 9/11. In way back, let's see, the Franco-Prussian War, there was no way the world thought that the Prussians could defeat the French. They had 3 battles in the Franco-Prussian War, and the Prussians won every one of them. So it was a shock to the world. They adopted that model. The eclipse that year was 0 degrees Capricorn. So everyone adopted the Prussian model, which led to World Wars I and II.
Now we're going to get to the Great Reset itself. There are 2 horoscopes that really represent the Great Reset. So they're 2 of the most important charts in mundane astrology today. As we've seen, Schwab announced the Great Reset in June of 2020. That month, on the very summer solstice itself, June the 21st, there was a solar eclipse.
Anything that occurs during an eclipse has an added degree of importance. During an eclipse, matters tend to speed up. They become more meaningful. It brings more feelings up from the depths. And there's a great deal of energy expended that declines after the eclipse. Solar eclipses generally start having an effect 90 days before they occur, and as long as a year afterwards. Lunar eclipses, it's 6 weeks on either side. Lunar eclipses are a bit weaker. A person is born, a kitten is born, somebody opens up a beauty salon, somebody else starts a corporation. All these things are under the auspices of an eclipse that is nearby. The question as to how much that eclipse affects that entity is done by a synastry between the eclipse chart and the natal chart. And let's not forget that Klaus Schwab announced the Great Reset during that month, so it's certainly within its orb. Just think of how many things could have possibly happened within months of this June eclipse. All those things are under the auspices of this eclipse. So if the eclipse, let's say the eclipse point is transited by Jupiter, all these entities will experience some Jupiterian event. If it's transited by Saturn, everyone will experience a Saturnine event.
But the key point is that the chart of this eclipse is one that we should keep in mind to understand the developing times. Transits to the eclipse point of this chart, particularly hard aspects, will speak to developments around Great Reset themes, including the establishment of a technology-based system of world governance. And as we've seen, the eclipse point is 0 Cancer, one of the 4 world points.
So this particular one, of course, the eclipse, as I said, is at 0 Cancer, and it is exactly opposite Cupido, which is the Uranian planet, which is conjunct Ixion, which is an actual existing dwarf planet out beyond Pluto. Cupido is the urge to merge. You will always find in the Uranian system, if somebody gets married, forms a club, a group, association, that's Cupido. In fact, I'm living in a community for people over 55. The guy who came up with this idea first spread the idea, and everybody is built there, nothing but retirement communities around me. Monroe Township was born on the day of a lunar eclipse conjunct Cupido.
So we have a hypothetical planet that's about groups of people conjunct Ixion, the dwarf planet that's been associated with sociopaths and psychopaths.
Ixion is a new planet, and Ixion, the minute I learned this with Alan Clay at Dwarf Planet University, he said the sociopathic personality, I mean, the archetypical figure would be the boss with the big head, the big broad shoulders, the booming voice, pounding the desk, and in control of every situation. But the psychopath works on 2 modes: seduce and intimidate. Seduce to get, the honey trap to get you into a person interested. Then once they feel like they have you interested, the gate goes down and they've got you trapped.
Great Reset, World Economic Forum, sociopaths, surely some mistake.
So I think Cupido is a group of people who would do this. So the strength of Ixion means there's just an awful lot of sociopathic or psychopathic people in our population, and they gravitate toward the centers of power and they take control, and you accept it or else. And look where it is. It is at the world point. And not only that, but the United States, the USA 1776 chart, Ixion is 0 to 1 Capricorn. So the United States was having its Ixion return, its conjunct Cupido. That is what that means. And that, of course, without the Uranian system and without Ixion, you don't see that.
And there's something else going on here. Eclipses are arranged in families known as Saros series. I won't get into the astronomy of these here because it's a little hard to get your head around, but essentially, roughly every 18 years, eclipses occur with very similar geometry in terms of the alignment of the sun, moon, and Earth. It's said by astrologers who have studied them that eclipses from the same Saros series have similar characters, or they mark events affecting the same regions of the world. Bill treats this subject in some depth in his excellent book, Mastering Geopolitical Prediction, Applied Mundane Astrology. The solar eclipse at 0 Cancer in June 2020 was a member of the Saros series known as 4 North. In her book, The Eagle and the Lark, the astrologer Bernadette Brady describes the character of every Saros series. Here's what she says about 4 North. Quote, restriction, inhibition, restraint, separation, and illusions are the trademarks of this family of eclipses. This is a difficult Saros series. I think it's fair to say that Brady nailed that one. An interesting question to ask is whether Klaus Schwab was aware of the transformative astrology of 2020. Something the author Joseph Farrell has argued in his books, including Babylon's Banksters is that the most powerful operators in the world, those who lie behind the financial system itself, and whom Schwab is no doubt in contact with, have always used astrology and continue to do so to this day. Now, according to the remote viewers, the Future Forecasting Group, whom we met in this recent episode, Klaus follows astrology and makes decisions on the basis of it. If that's the case, then he'd undoubtedly know of the astrological and historical significance of the time period when he launched the Great Reset. And then 6 months later, there was another astrological event of major importance tied to one of the world points. On December the 21st, 2020, there was a conjunction of Jupiter and Saturn at 0 degrees of Aquarius, marking the end of the transition from the age of Earth to the age of air. What was remarkable about this conjunction is that it took place on the winter solstice. This means the Sun is at 0 Capricorn, one of the world points in the chart of the conjunction.
I had been writing for Dell Horoscope for 30 years at that point, so I had never seen a configuration like this. So I took the software and I ran it back, and I had to go back to the years 300 and 400 to find any Jupiter-Saturn conjunctions that had the Sun at 0 cardinal. That's how rare that is. To find an eclipse at 0 Cancer opposite the Sun 6 months later in the Jupiter-Saturn conjunction chart, this is extremely rare. This means some extraordinary event is going to occur. Jupiter-Saturn conjunctions, in case you don't know, supposedly define the political economic picture for the next 20 years. In my book, Planetary Economic Forecasting, I stopped for a minute. I said, wait just a minute. How could the Jupiter-Saturn conjunction in 1920 described the next 20 years, because we had a huge boom 20 through 30, and then we had a depression 30 through 38 or so. I cast a horoscope for the Jupiter-Saturn opposition in 1931, and that described the next 9 years, 10 years, much more accurately than did the Jupiter-Saturn conjunction. So I'm passing that along to anybody who wants to research it. This particular one is Jupiter and Saturn are conjunct at 0 Aquarius 29. Now, let me point out that I haven't seen anybody else say this yet, but that is right at the Uranus-Pluto midpoint. And the definition of Uranus-Pluto is drastic change or sharp change in financial position.
Now, to be clear, the Uranus-Pluto midpoint that Bill is referring to is one that you can only see on a 90-degree dial, which is another key tool in Uranian astrology that you won't have seen on this channel before. Essentially, the 90-degree dial derives from the insight that the aspects that signify the most concrete effects in the world are the hard aspects. That's the conjunctions, squares, and oppositions between planets. So any planets that are at the same degree of a sign of the same modality are in hard aspect with each other. For example, a planet at 10 Aries is in hard aspect to any planet close to 10 Cancer, 10 Libra, or 10 Capricorn. On a 90-degree dial, the two planets would both appear at 10 degrees. A 90-degree dial is really the zodiac folded on top of itself 4 times. And in this chart, which will signify developments in political economy over the 2020s and possibly beyond, the 90-degree dial reveals the signature of Uranus combined with Pluto.
It's a drastic change in the way the economy runs overall, where they were attempting to make a drastic shift. So this is the hothouse rush into electric vehicles and trying to redo the entire economy. Uranus-Pluto, a drastic change. And if you also notice, the Sun is conjunct Mercury at 0 to 1 Capricorn. Now, what effect is that? And what I related that to was doxing, words escape and have consequences, discrimination through words, that you have to be more careful what you say. I mean, particularly online, we found that out. And also, this chart has Mars square Pluto, and that is the widespread increase in violence, which you're seeing everywhere because they're not enforcing the laws. So Mars-Pluto squares, I doubt you can get through 20 years without a great amount of violence. Also, we have Pallas, which is the asteroid, which has to do with intellectual brilliance. It also rules pointed objects. It is square Apollon. Now, Apollon is a Uranian planet that has everything to do with distribution. So if someone is into marketing and distribution, they probably have a strong Apollon. Jupiter is big, Apollon is many. So the Pallas square Apollon, I said to myself, what could that possibly be but some new development in technology that's available to everybody? And I think I think we see it right now. Artificial intelligence. Also, Pallas, because Pallas Athena had a spear and rules pointed objects, bows, arrows, lances, javelins, needles. Many people got injections. So you could read a lot from this chart. And these tend to be longer term influences that you see for at least 10 years, probably 20.
Something else the horoscope promises from a Uranian perspective is the destruction of economic value because of a pandemic.
Neptune and Vesta are in the same place. Now, Vesta is an asteroid, and I first studied the asteroid with the lady who introduced them to astrology, Eleanor Bach, and she said Vesta is in vestments. It's you want to keep something safe and sacred, so it's maintaining things, keeping them secure. All stock traders, people who trade in stock, bonds, and paper, have a strong Vesta. You have Neptune Vesta here. That's the same configuration that Bernie Madoff and Charles Ponzi had in their natal charts. False Neptune securities, Vesta. And here you have it. It was set off during the collapse of Sam Bankman-Fried's cryptocurrency scam, because this Neptune Vesta equals Vulcanus and Apollon. Now, Apollon, I mentioned, is widespread. Vulcanus means it's extremely widespread. And if you read in the book, and I've got that right in front of me, it says Neptune Vulcanus, epidemic, infection, inflation, destruction of prosperity, great deterioration, corruption, and spread of corruption. So I think it's this autumn that configuration gets set off again. So I'm predicting another big wipeout somewhere in the investment world, probably in cryptocurrencies because it's so new. So that's another major configuration. That's Neptune Vesta equals Apollon Vulcanus.
So we can read a lot about the pandemic and indeed the period up to 2030 or maybe even 2040 just from this horoscope. Now, the interesting thing from today's perspective is that we are about to see another big astrological event that will stimulate all four of the world points, because in February 2026 we'll see a conjunction of Saturn and Neptune at 0 degrees of Aries. And in the extended version of this video, available exclusively to members of World Astrology Report, we're going to see what Bill thinks that conjunction might mean. And as a bonus, we're also going to get his thoughts on Uranus's forthcoming transit through the sign of Gemini. Uranus was in Gemini at the birth of the United States, so Uranus returning to this sign constitutes the country's Uranus return. Since 1776, every time Uranus has returned to Gemini, the country has engaged in an armed conflict that ended up reconfiguring the United States and its institutions. So head over to my website, www.worldastrologyreport.com, if you're interested in subscribing and getting access to a growing library of exclusive content, including the extended version of this very episode and several previous ones. So that's it for this episode. Thanks so much to Bill Meridian for joining me. I've read his book on mundane astrology, Mastering Geopolitical Prediction, Applied Mundane Astrology myself, and I can tell you that it's truly excellent. You can find that and all his other work at his website, billmeridian.com. But otherwise, if you've been intrigued by the material in this episode, and particularly the burgeoning technocratic state that's under construction, then you might want to know more about the spiritual undercurrents to these developments. And on that subject, I have you covered on this channel too. I suggest you watch this video, in which I consider the figure of Ahriman, Rudolf Steiner's conception of the embodiment of materialism. Steiner said that Ahriman would incarnate into the world around this time, and Ahriman would no doubt be delighted at the prospect of the success of the Great Reset project. Thanks, and see you next time.